Hey guys, Professor Jeff here again. Today we are talking mostly about morality and looking at two very distinct perspectives on what could make an action moral. Specifically, we're going to be looking at Immanuel Kant's deontological approach to morality, that is a rule-based system, versus John Stuart Mill's consequentialist approach to morality, which, as the name implies, has more to do with the consequences. We're going to go over that a little bit generally at the beginning, and I'm going to go into each thinker in detail a little bit just to help explain some of Kant's typically difficult terminology, as well as how John Stuart Mill brings back this problem of hedonism that we've been tracking over the course of the semester. Get ready. Here we are, as promised, a simple general breakdown of these two thinkers and their specific differences with their approach to morality. But first, let's talk about their biographical details a little bit. Kant was a German philosopher in the 1700s, that is the 18th century, and his approach to morality is typically referred to as deontology, which means this is a moral system that places an emphasis on rules. Okay? So Kant's specific moral law is what he calls the categorical imperative. Okay, and now he formulates the categorical imperative in a couple of different ways. The simplest really is essentially act on that maxim, only which you could universalize to all people, right? So when he says maxims, he's really talking about rules. It's just kind of a fancy word for a personal rule or guideline. So the categorical imperative states, only act on those rules that you would be okay with everybody else following, right? So something like do not cheat, do not steal, do not kill. We could fairly safely apply these to all of the rest of humanity and assume that that's okay. We could be happy with those rules applying to everybody all the time, except for maybe in some specific situations. Kant also gives us this interesting concept of autonomy, which I'll go into a little bit as part of the focus on each individual philosopher, just so we can understand what he means by this. Generally, most of the time, this is thought to mean something like independence, which isn't a bad place to begin to understand this concept, but it's not, it doesn't completely capture exactly what he means here. So, moving on to John Stuart Mill. He was around in the 1800s, that is the 19th century. He was an English philosopher who was really best known for his support of utilitarianism. Okay? Utilitarianism is a moral theory that is consequentialist. Okay? So consequentialist moral theories are going to focus on what the outcomes of our actions are over the rules that we should be following, right? And Mill's specific formulation of his consequentialist approach is what he calls the greatest happiness principle. That is, actions are moral insofar as they promote happiness for the greatest number of people. Okay, and we'll look at that a little bit more closely, especially how he defines happiness and the implications of that. But this should be a good starting place for us to understand the differences in their approach to morality. Kant writes in the first section of our reading, "Thus, the moral worth of an action does not lie in the effect expected from it, for all these effects could be brought about by other causes." Essentially, what this means is we shouldn't judge the morality of an action by the consequences that we expect from it, because those are ultimately unpredictable and outside of our control. He says, instead, the preeminent good, which we call moral, can therefore consist in nothing else than the conception of law in itself, which is only possible in a rational being. Kant is very particular about linking this idea of law with the idea of rationality. He believes only rational beings are capable of following rules and are therefore capable of being moral. This concept of autonomy can be best understood through this quote in the second section The laws to which he is subject are only those of his own giving, though at the same time they are universal, and that he is only bound to act in conformity with his own will. So, according to Kant, this idea of autonomy is essentially only having to obey laws that you yourself would give to others. To come back to John Stuart Mill, as we went over, his utilitarian idea, the greatest happiness principle, states that an action is right insofar as it promotes happiness for the greatest number of people. He then goes on to define happiness as the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. This is a hedonistic principle, right? Let's just to remind ourselves, hedonism is the philosophical belief that pleasure is an intrinsic good. This is very similar to Epicurus's take on hedonism, but Mill complicates the problem in a way that actually I think makes a lot of sense. He divides pleasures into higher and lower pleasures, and he says that higher pleasures are associated with people. Only people can really experience these, and these are pleasures of the mind, such as the use of our imagination and our emotions, while lower pleasures are common to people and animals, and they are more closely associated with the body, particularly in acts of consumption. So, he says that people will always prefer these higher pleasures if they know them, and that promoting higher pleasures is greater than promoting lower pleasures. So this factors into this greatest happiness principle. All right, guys, that is it for today. We went over a couple of big, important philosophical, specifically moral concepts. Remember, deontology, which is associated with Immanuel Kant. That's the focus on adherence to rules as what determines the morality of an action. And we looked at consequentialism, which is John Stuart Mill's approach, which favors the outcome of our actions in determining the morality of them. We also looked at Kant's concept of autonomy and John Stuart Mill's update on the problem of hedonism that we've been looking at over the course of the semester. So look, all of these terms and ideas are excellent things to include in your final papers as well, so definitely keep track of that, update your ideas, and of course email me if you have any questions. See you guys next time.